So for next class, we should read, or at least even if we don't get there, the goal is to start the Hegel reading on the syllogism from the the minor logic, the encyclopedia logic. So the excerpt is uploaded on our website, right? So you can just find it. And there's a section that begins, and a page and a half into it, there's the discussion of the syllogism, right? So let's read the Hegel for next time. Hopefully we'll get to it, but that'll definitely take at least 2 classes because it's viciously interesting and beautiful and tough. All right, so let's continue the Ilyenkov. So we started this last time, and let's start from page 11 of the Ilyenkov reading. And what I propose to do is let's just go through this together, the reading, and then read through passages and stop as necessary because there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening. And again, this little bit of I just got this January issue of Monthly Review, and I noticed that they've also published one of Ilyenkov's essays on the logic and dialectics from his book Dialectical Logic, along with an essay.
Which one is it? Because I brought the back.
On the coincidence of logic and dialectics with the theory of knowledge and materialism.
Yeah, so it's essay 9 in this book.
Of the Dialectical Logic book, yeah.
It's about 40 pages.
And there's an intro, sort of an essay, setting Ilyenkov in the context of Soviet philosophy by this prominent contemporary Russian philosopher, student of Ilyenkov's, Maidansky. So
yeah,
it would be an interesting to read. And so Ilyenkov is sort of making his way through, in the English language, I guess, more and more, which is good.
Well, he's coming in for, the interesting moment of that in terms of social relations is its monthly review that's doing this. It's not Science and Society, it's not, New Left Review, it's not these other journals, it's really a very, early...
To their credit.
Paul Sweezy and Harry Magdoff.
To the credit of Monthly Review's editors.
Right, that the old school in terms of the relationship to Soviet Marxism, if you will.
And Monthly Review has published a number of interesting essays. One of the essays I remember, I think it was written by John Bellamy Foster from 3-4 years ago, was about the debate on global warming, and he shows in there that the early pioneering models of global warming were done by the Soviet scientists in the 50s and 60s, who kind of raised the alarm that global warming is happening.
Yeah.
And they did the math, the initial math and the initial models. But then the country fell apart, so they kind of got lost in the shuffle. So Monthly Review, again, kind of held the lead on this and bringing that story to English readers. So on page 11 of the Ilyenkov essay, the school should teach how to think. We did this Kant quote, this great Kant quote on the previous page that Ilyenkov cites. So on top of page 11, I think one of the important ideas here that we need to keep in mind is in this broader essay is Ilyenkov says intelligence is not a natural gift, but is an acquired skill. Now, of course, this might sound totally obvious and completely obvious, but it's not, given contemporary debates about this, right? There's still the position that intelligence is sort of genetically rooted, that position is still active out there. There's still trains of thought that believe that, there are different races of people, and all that stuff. But Ilyenkov is saying this very clearly. Intelligence is not a natural gift. Genetics and sort of evolution gives us the capacity to think in a certain way, out of which intelligence emerges and human culture and everything else. But all these things are political functions. So whether you're going to develop yourself and your intellect or not is not genetically determined for Ilyenkov. It's basically a function of social upbringing, like the type of world that you grew up in. And not just the type of schooling that you had, but the broader culture and broader cultures that you inherited by living in a particular society. Which, by the way, I think emphasizes the importance of politics. Because only through political struggle that shapes a particular society in a particular way can you create a certain culture or cultures.
And it's the economic relationship as well, right? Like the relationship to work,
Right.
and how it's structured.
Yeah, I mean, if my life is reduced to just working and selling my labor power for 10 hours a day, and I have no time and thus the ability to do anything else that I might be interested or capable of, I'm just not going to do it. And I'm just going to stay on that level of human development, social, political development. I'm just not going to tap into that part of me. But everybody has that ability to grow intellectually. I think that's a very radical. That's essentially the essence of communist politics.
This is Marx and the German
Yeah.
ideology in 18.
Exactly. This is the essence of
social being determines consciousness.
Exactly.
Exactly. This is the essence of communist politics.
I have written thoughts or reflections of actual events in the real world, and that this is their only origin.
Right.
I think he said something to that effect.
Mhm.
Right. So in other words, liberal society will never make this promise.
Yeah.
It'll never make the promise that the goal of liberal society is the full formation and development intellectually and culturally of every American. Like liberal society will never make that promise.
Well, hence the failure, if you really look at this in the past 50 years of American education, even though there was affirmative action in a real moment in the schools for about 8 to 10 years,
Right.
everything is now the devastation of the public school system fully and fuller and more privatization, in a way. So this is clear that the liberal and the neoliberal moment wants nothing to do with this. And the liberal is always in bad faith because they always talk about, structural inequality, and inequality, but never really try to remedy this at the base.
Because it's not part of their politics. They don't care about that. They don't believe this to be true. They don't believe that intelligence is not a natural gift but an acquired skill. They don't believe that at heart.
Right.
They believe in opportunities, but opportunity simply means you have the ability to compete. It's an economic logic. It's an economic sort of capitalist logic. You have the right to compete for an education, and as long as you were given the opportunity, then society is basically functioning well. This is a completely different message.
Right. I just want to make a reference to one text that's very relevant here. Yeah. All of the Genes by Richard Levin is a great
Which text? Which
All of the Genes.
All in the Genes.
By a man named Richard Levin, Leontin. It's from a book called Biology as Ideology, the Doctrine of DNA. And it's very, very good, in this sense. He actually throws out a thing about the race to the finish line. He goes through class analysis and really talking about exactly what Ilyenkov is doing here. But this is later. I know this is earlier than Levin's essays dated from the 80s.
From the 80s.
After the beginning of the new, DNA.
Well, one of the interesting subplots of Ilyenkov's entire corpus of thinking is a deep critique, aggressive critique of positivism, particularly through cybernetics. Like he did not like the way Soviet cyberneticians also were influential in organizing or dreaming of a society organized along this kind of a technocratic kind of primitivism, according to Ilyenkov. So you're going to see, we'll read later on, I think, another kind of a satire, a satirical play that he wrote, about 40, 50 pages, where it's a conversation between a human being and I think a cyborg, like a supercomputer, and there's like a hyper supercomputer called the black box, which judges all the problems that cannot be solved by the other lower level computers, and it solves those problems by simply ignoring them because it can't deal with a contradiction, right? On the level of circuits. Yeah.
No, there's a book that came out pretty recently, last few years, by Robert Sapolsky, who's a neurobiologist, called Behave, which is pretty technical in its nature, but it essentially ruminates on whether there's any kind of real free will to human being. But what's pertinent here, though, is that he spends a good deal of time discussing intelligence as rooted in biology, but also something that develops in the womb. In other words, something that's very much affected by the environment, and how much it gets expressed later on in life is very much bounded by the experience of the child, of the mother, of the family, before we generally think of life as having any kind of experiential experiences.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah,
So, for instance, stress. If you have a mother under deep stress while pregnant, you typically will find that it affects the development of the child, and certain potentials are never reached in the ability of the child to reason, to think, some working memory.
And I
just
think
doesn't develop.
didn't also predispose, I think I heard about this, didn't it also predispose those kids who were born, those fetuses who were born under stressed mother, for example, didn't they also develop heart disease earlier? Like there are all
You
kinds
can make all
of...
kinds of
Yeah.
predictions about
Yeah.
what's going to happen later in life
Yeah,
by essentially the class of the person,
yeah.
during pregnancy.
Again, the
Which
political and
is-
the political, social, economic, cultural effects, yeah. It's not just your DNA and your race, as the old school racist used to say, or the, yeah.
Could I ask you, because so we were talking about, according to Ilyenkov, how human intellect is in a way culturally / politically overdetermined. But at the same time, we also talked about the economic limitations as to the personal development of the development of one's personal intellect. So and insofar as at least in modernity, individual's development is always already mediated through the socio-economic condition. Could we advance the claim that the economic is effectively part of nature, or the economic overdetermination is in a sense natural overdetermination? So maybe we're once again back to the beginning, where we discuss, where we contemplate whether it is culturally overdetermined or whether it is naturally overdetermined. But nature here, again, is already economical. So I think this is almost like a scandalous and traumatic.
By the way, Ilyenkov's use of the word culture is not narrow the way we tend to understand it today, but vastly broader. So for him, culture is one way to think about culture in Ilyenkov is basically the entire ensemble of things that you inherit simply by being born in a particular society, in a particular configuration. So your culture, if you were born in the Soviet Union in the 1919 or 1920, your culture is overdetermined by not only your immediate family or primary caretaker's own inherited, cultural, which also includes political
Yes.
and economic features, but also the broader society as well. So culture is not sort of what the way our liberal society would associate with culture, like appreciation, like value added. Like you go to the museum, you listen to classical music. For Ilyenkov, culture is basically everything that you inherit as you grow up and you live your
I'm
life.
reminded of Lukács's thesis in History and Consciousness, where he claims that the human subject is socially mediated. So the category of the social is, for him, is a transcendental category.
Of course. Remember, this starts from Aristotle, and then we go straight to Marx. I mean, you can add other
This is
people.
highly mediated, by the way. Lukács was one of his teachers is Delphi, who was the first to problematize culture as such as Arto is presenting it,
Yeah.
which Ilyenkov is obviously very well
Ilyenkov
aware
corresponded with
as an
Lukács.
definition
By the way, this is an
of
interesting
Delphi's
trivial
notion.
sort of trivia. Ilyenkov was a translator of texts by Lukács and Hegel in Russian, right? So in the 1960s, there was a major encyclopedia that was being put together called Philosophical Encyclopedia in the Soviet Union. And they didn't finish it because sort of Brezhnev ascended to power and then the climate changed. But Ilyenkov was one of the senior editors who wrote the articles on, some of the major articles in the Philosophical Encyclopedia. And part of that project was he was also translating works by Lukács in Russian and Hegel. So he wrote to Lukács and he said, "Oh, by the way, I have a question about this. Could you please clarify what you meant? My German is not good enough." And Lukács wrote back, and he said, "I'm very, honored that you're translating my work, but instead of asking me and waiting for my answer over the mail, why don't you ask your colleague who lives in Moscow right next to you by the name of Alexander Lifshitz, who was a famous Soviet philosopher who was older than Ilyenkov." So that's how Ilyenkov sort of fomented this friendship with Lifshitz through the figure of Lukács. So in other words, it's not surprising that you made that association because this was somebody who was reading Lukács and Hegel
Lukács was the Spanish mediator.
you know, and knew him, you know, essentially. I mean, as a correspondent, or through Lifshitz, who was a close friend of Lukács. So yeah, there's an entire thread of European philosophy here that is becoming illuminated as we read more and more about Ilyenkov and the big Soviet thinkers, because they were deeply plugged into the rest of European philosophy, of course. You know, that old story that during the Cold War the Soviets didn't have good philosophy because they were all like hacks is completely false. I mean, of course there were hacks, but they were, as we will find out eventually when this stuff gets translated, they were incredibly important schools that are not translated as of yet. I mean, Ilyenkov is sort of the most translated one because even though we haven't translated his major works, I mean, his biggest work is partially translated. I think we're missing like 300 pages from the volume.
I'm still thinking about, you know, whether it is really appropriate to subsume the category of the economic.
I'm not substituting I'm just saying.
Right.
Intelligence is not a natural gift, but it's an acquired skill. So where is it acquired? It's acquired. One way to think about it, it's acquired politically, in the politeia. I mean, you can use Aristotle's language, you know. In other words, the emphasis here is, remember, this is written in the Soviet Union in the context of a society in transition that's trying to build a new political system. So this work is polemical in nature as well, on another level. He's basically saying, look, it's very important what happens in terms of our political system and the decisions we make in terms of our legal structure, political structure, economic structure, because that's going to determine the level of the intelligence that is developed as such on the level of the population as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he's writing about schools and teaching.
There are great empirical examples of this at work in history. One, of course, is Malcolm X in prison, who has a very limited vocabulary and starts just going through the dictionary and becomes, you know, acclimated to the use of words and definition. And worlds start to open up for him, in a sense. So this is a very different thing, right? In terms of, you know, that somehow this is a gift that is genetically determined, right,
yes,
etc. Or really, in a sense, economic background too. As Sartre, there used to be a French kid who was homeless, an orphan, so to speak, that used to go up to the cafe window and peer at Sartre and de Beauvoir. He invites him in, finds out he's illiterate. After a year with Sartre working with him through Sartre's own pedagogy, he's writing 2 novels, right? Becomes a major performer in very famous in Paris, you know, etc. So in a sense, what he's proposing here, and at least to me, is that, you know, we really are in hidden territory, right? And we don't know the a priori, really, in a sense. And then we have gotten to the point, right, where we have all these predetermined notions about how we learn or how learning machines operate and all these things, and we're not really, you know, we're never going beyond experience. I think in a way that his radicality, at least from what I'm seeing here, is he's going beyond the experiential, you know, and saying there's something beyond that in terms of this learning, you know.
I appreciate his critical stance towards positivism.
Not only positivism, but really generic, you know, learning strategies, including behaviorism, including you know, consciousness theories of consciousness, and etc. So
I'll just leave it.
Okay, no.
no, I'm just saying, you know, I'm just open it up to. You know.
Did you have?
It occurred to me that it occurred to me that. His thinking is somewhat similar to a structuralist anthropological idea about culture. It's not culture of this value. Culture is just, you know, everything upon which we live as such. But what seems to be different is that is there a notion here that like the time of now has a vibrancy of open possibilities, whereas for structural anthropologists they would think of it more like the structures are trans-historical. You can't just...
There are trans-historical in Ilyenkov, I mean, of course, but it's a function of struggle in the moment. There's struggle. Like, it can go any way. It can become, you know, education could be the domain of the racist or biological, you know, eugenicists. I mean, people who believe in genetics overdetermines our ability to, our upper limit, so to speak, cognitively. education could be taken over by people like that, and thus the curriculum will change accordingly, or it could go in a totally different direction. So it's all a function of, this is a political text, you know.
I mean, social Darwinism. Another
And the Soviet
Right.
education system had both, of
Yeah.
course. It had its kind of, eventually the positivists and sort of maintained their dominance or became more dominant, but early on and throughout the Soviet history, there was this thread of radical kind of educational radicalism like Ilyenkov's. Just to say one more thing before I go on, you know, the subplot here is, you know, there was a school that Ilyenkov was associated with for, you know, severely disabled kids, you know, kids who were blind, deaf, and mute. And this became known as the Zagorsk Experiment. In the town of Zagorsk, there was a school that was set up, experimental school, by a Soviet psychologist, a friend of Ilyenkov's. And Ilyenkov became one of the major teachers there. And the basic premise was exactly this, that even though those kids are born completely incapable of inheriting their culture, because they can't hear, they can't see, they can't speak, so there's a very limited apparatus with which they can perceive anything, right? Because they can only perceive the world through vibrations, through their fingers and toes, basically. Because they can't hear, they can't see, and they can't. But Ilyenkov and his friend basically said, no, this can't be true. If we're right, if Marx and the entire tradition of Marxism and Aristotle and so on and so forth are correct, then intelligence will develop in these children if we have the appropriate way of transmitting to them and exposing to them our culture. So they invented a language, they invented a way of writing and reading through tapping. So you could tap your fingers like Morse code almost, and the kids, like little kids, they learned, you know, how to read and write. And they learned everything. The most challenging thing was to make sense of music and visual art. Because sculpture they could feel with their hands, but visual arts and music presented a specific challenge because they could never hear the music. And I'm just paraphrasing one of his famous students, Alexander Suvorov. He's alive, he's in his 60s, he's kind of a prominent psychologist. He's one of those kids who went to the Zagorsk experiment. He's on Facebook, like I'm a follower. And he writes poetry and he has a page and writes books. But he said this in one of his reflections on Ilyenkov a couple years ago. He said he contemplated suicide because he understood that he could never understand music. He could never gain access to music because he can't hear the sounds. And he wrote a letter to Ilyenkov, which I think is translated now, or maybe it will be soon, where he says, I'm going to kill myself, essentially, because no matter how much I've learned, I understand that certain things are never going to be accessible to me that are accessible to every other human. And I just can't overcome that. Like, I just feel... And Ilyenkov wrote this very moving letter back. He said, look, if you know, people who are not disabled like you, he said, I'm not going to lie that your disabilities are not important or not severe, but he said, if people who did not have your disabilities knew 1/1,000,000th of what you've gained in your understanding of what does it mean to be human, the world will be a much better place. And then that letter essentially changed his mind and he didn't commit suicide, according to Suvorov. I mean, these were very serious people who were dealing with extremely serious things, you know, in terms of questions of what does it mean to be a human being and so on and so forth. So I think this is sort of the immediate background to this kind of initial statement about the intelligence. But let's just go on. So the next paragraph, fortunately, this is not so. It is true that the ability, page 11, or skill to think cannot be grafted into the brain in the form of a collection of rules, formulas, and as people like to say nowadays, algorithms. Of course, he's anticipating this, right? I mean, Facebook is working on, what is that interface now? That's going to allow you don't need a mouse anymore, right? That's the goal. You'll just be able to like navigate a computer system without moving your hand, just by thinking. Of course, that's useful for somebody who might be disabled or, you know, but there are other implications here too that, you know, we can sort of... So Ilyenkov is saying a human being is still a human being, much as some would like to turn him into a machine. In other words, let's ask this question. How do we delineate the machine from the human? There's no identity between, you know, I mean, if we were to write this, he's saying it doesn't make any sense to do this. That you know, a human being, or in the plural, you know, some kind of an identity can be established with any kind of a machinic being. He says, it's not possible. He says, this is very dangerous and futile. I mean, you can do it. You can do it. You can create a intellectual framework and an ideology that says, human beings are nothing but machinic beings. They're a form of data structure. You can almost, you can see this, a form of some data structure. You can represent human beings, a person as a data structure living in a computer. That's Facebook's profile. You can have attributes that are infinite. You can have 5 million attributes, and the more you have, the more finely you'll describe somebody's personality or capabilities or whatever. You can do that. You can take this approach, or you can, as I like to call it these days, I think we're building towards the formation of digital social objects. You can live in a society where digital social objects have, for example, replaced even the liberal notion of a citizen. Right? You can have digital social objects. But Ilyenkov is saying actually you can go in that direction, but you're not going to really get what you think you're getting. You're going to get something that's trivial and stupid and kind of course, harmful. So don't do that reduction.
Well, this becomes the dominant Cartesian model that positivism and other forms of cybernetic thinking take up. That basically, when Descartes says we're thinking things, he is sort of talking about the machinic-like, and the assemblage in Guattari and Deleuze are also part of the
anticipate this kind of
yes, and anticipate this kind of thing going forward. So, we have to be, at least to my mind, we have to be careful about this instead of falling into the old humanist trap, right?
Well, then we need to
just saying it's the human being versus the machine.
Well, we need to reformulate the question then.
So,
we need to reformulate the question then.
Yeah.
What is human
Right.
in the context? Right? This is probably the question of the possibility of a society of digital social objects. Mm-hmm. Digital objects, computer-enabled objects that function socially, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the big questions of today. So in other words, this is probably one of the guiding questions, or guided questions, if we want to continue Ilyenkov's sort of thinking. So then what is human? What does it mean, or what does it mean to be human in the context of the possibility of digital social objects? So I think it's important to define and understand what is a digital social object, a product of cybernetics, generalized computing, network computers, and all the software, sort of analytical frameworks that are laid on top of it, which start to function socially. These things start to have social effects. So like when big data and all these things are used to do things that actually have an effect in society, how does that change the fundamental question of what does it mean to be? So I think Ilyenkov is sort of suggesting this, although he's not. He's just sort of directly attacking the cybernetics, sort of without necessarily going in that next part. But I think that's an important question for today. For example, using computer technology for human use, if you will, or instead of rejecting it outright, right?
But I think the question of what is human in the context of the possibility. In the context of contemporary technology, is that I think it has two dimensions. The first is that it's simply a continuation of the formulation of the human subject in response to certain challenges. In other words, the human subject, following Nietzsche's reflection, is a consequence, a response towards a certain challenge, a response to a certain question. So the task is to figure out what the question is. But I think in the opposite direction, the digital, big data, singular, subject is a sort of displacement, a disavow. It's a disavow of of said challenges. So it forecloses the possibilities that is brought forth through the technological development, which is imminent in the reproduction of global capital.
Yeah, I mean,
so
in a certain sense, this is nothing new. This is just the latest stage, because we know many people, Husserl has said this, and my friends in Sofia in Bulgaria and the Institute of Supermodern Supermodernity have written a lot about this, that, capitalism is sort of, capitalists, got lucky when their economic activity intersected with Galilean science, right? With the notion since Galileo that everything that humans do or perceive about the world or live in the world or how they live can be mathematicized, right? This was sort of one of Galileo's great sort of contribution. So when capitalist economic practices, or logic, if you will, fuses with Galilean science, i.e. modern science, you have these types of processes, of which this is the latest iteration, right? So the latest iteration is the socialization of cybernetics. Cybernetics has left the labs, military research labs, right, which were started in World War II, radar and all this stuff, where sort of scientists did their work for the military, and then they went home. When that science left the lab and became infused in the economy, its ways of thinking became harnessed by, let's say, corporations that make and sell stuff through the logic of the capitalist market. Then you have the socialization of cybernetics, which starts to have political, social effects on people as a whole. Whether you want to use the word people or humans or the society or subjectivity or subjects or whatever. So the point is, that's what we're facing now. We're facing the latest iteration of the intersection of Galilean science and the capitalist as a class, or capitalist economics, which has produced the socialization of a particular new type of a science, which didn't exist in the 19th century, which is called cybernetics, which is machines, human-made machines that have certain capabilities that did not exist in machines before computers, right? So, and how does that change what does it mean to exist as a human being? If you don't like the word human being, then what do you call yourself? Software?
Well, the Heideggerian framework there would be, of course, we're at the end of philosophy. Philosophy is closed, right? It's entered its phase of closure, right? The age of Hegel is the closure, right, so to speak. It's
And Ilyenkov is very much working in a certain sense in that age.
So what really happens now is what's being juxtaposed is not so much the human versus the machine, but the task of thinking. And what does it mean to really think? Given about what this article is about too. What is really called thinking, to use a Heideggerian phrase. I don't want to impose Heidegger onto Ilyenkov, but it seems to me they have a similar stakes in some ways.
It's on the importance of formulating the right question.
Yes, exactly.
So what is called thinking? So
it's no longer a question of the human versus the anti-human or the humanist controversy in the Althusserian sense. Or is it a question of structuralism versus existentialism, and the structuralism ultimately leads to a closed totality. If you really read Levi-Strauss, it's a tyrannical feedback system. It's transcendental subject, ego without a subject. There's no subjectivity left in structuralism, in this way. So the question, again, is for us, I think you're posing, but it's very interesting, philosophically, is what is thinking? How do we pose the tasks of thinking? What are those tasks actually about? As well as, what does it mean as you're trying to figure out to be human, or is there such a thing as the human anymore, or is it just existence? Is it just Dasein? Is it just, time? And being, in relational,
Ilyenkov's answer is going to be
things like that.
Ilyenkov's answer is going to be the fully developed. He says, what is a political project? What is communism? Communist society is a society where the vast majority of people have developed fully.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the shortest definition.
That's Gramsci too, of course.
Yeah, that's the shortest formulation.
Gramsci, yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's a pretty useful way of thinking about it. Because again, liberal society will never frame it that way. It's just not part of the calculus. It's different.
The new man.
Yeah.
The whole thing, the birth of the
Yeah.
new subject, yeah.
Exactly.
Which was really the attraction, if you will. in
The new Soviet person.
1970,
The new Soviet person.
1970, right? Exactly.
What about cyborg? Is
It
the cyborg?
wasn't Vladimir Putin. Yeah, anyway, he'll be there till 2024. The legacy.
Yeah. So a human being is still a human being, page 11, much as some would like to turn him into a machine. In the form of algorithms, you can insert into the skull only a mechanical, that is, a very stupid mind, the mind of a cashier, but not the mind of a mathematician. Now, there's an interesting background. I'm not going to get into it. He was friends with a lot of the famous Soviet mathematicians, one of whom was Shilov. You can get his books in English. He was sort of a prominent mathematician. And their letters, they wrote letters to each other, they corresponded. And Shilov was interested in philosophy. He was troubled by he was curious about, what is the meaning of mathematical insights and all these things. And it was an interesting feature of Soviet mathematicians in general, some of their greatest figures. The one I watched most recently, he died a couple of years ago, was Arnold. And you can watch he's on YouTube. I think he died in 2013 or something. One of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. And Arnold is deeply, constantly interested in the philosophical implications of mathematics. And that's a very interesting thing among mathematicians too. And I attribute that to the cultural formation that they came out of, which was such that, at least for the best representatives, there was more to math than the actual technicalities of the problem solving. There was much more. The bigger questions were, what is the meaning of this? There were these sort of there were these philosophical quests that were motivating Shilov and Arnold, sort of these famous mathematicians, in thinking about math as a philosophy rather than as a positivist, formalized, mathematicized type of logic instead of a dialectical logic, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, we can talk more about Arnold. He's very funny. You can watch his lectures. Some of them are in English. And he hates computers. In terms of how we, he says, I can't understand why my graduate students have to use Mathematica or MATLAB to do problems. He says that's ridiculous.
They go crazy in the counter.
He went crazy.
I've already come to the very simple arithmetical operations of how much the bill is before they've rung it up on the computer.
Oh yeah.
How'd you do that? How'd you do that? It's simple. It's like eighth grade math. Simple calculations.
So just to go on. So the next paragraph, page 11, again, the ability to think is not a natural gift. This is an interesting puzzle again. Our ability to think is not a natural gift. However, just to read that paragraph, the arguments cited above by no means exhaust the position even of Kant, let alone that of a materialist. First, it is not true that intelligence is a natural gift. For his mind or his ability to think, man owes just as little to Mother Nature as he does to God the Father. Right? So there's a very clear statement here that contra racists, for example, or liberals, often that means the same thing in its origin.
And nature is essentially the same construct as God the Father,
Right.
And
it's the secular God.
Socially determined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To
so
nature,
there is no nature.
There is no nature, right. And in other words, to nature, we owe only our brain, the organ of thinking. In other words, just the biochemistry. You have certain cells that fire certain neurons. That's wonderful because that enables us to do the other stuff. But the other stuff might never happen if you don't live in a political space that does not put you in a condition of development of your one of his influencers, the psychologist Vygotsky, would simply say the higher thinking functions. And this, of course, paraphrases Spinoza. Spinoza has this great quote, I forget from which book. Spinoza says, every human mind, I'm paraphrasing, every human being has the ability to think, but sadly, almost nobody knows how to think.
Yeah, the emendation of the intellect.
Okay. Right? This comes from Spinoza too. That we all have the apparatus and the ability to think, but it's not automatically developed simply because we're born as humans. It's not a function of just biology. In fact, from biology, we get very little. We just get the ability to breathe, to, sort of our immune system and so on and so forth, and the ability to have a brain that has a certain makeup, which makes other things, much more interesting things possible. As for his ability to think with the aid of his brain, it not only develops in the sense of improves, but also first emerges only together with his attachment to social human culture, to knowledge. So the particular type of a culture, social human culture that you're attached to, is the most important thing that's going to determine whether you'll develop that way or not. The same goes for his ability to walk upright, which man likewise does not get from nature. This is the same kind of skill as all the other human abilities. Anyway, so we can go on. On the bottom of this page, he says, by shifting the blame onto nature, we preserve a clear conscience and keep us. Okay. Anyways, so this is sort of when teachers are bad and they're not interested or they don't know how to engage the intellectual development of their students, they say, well, you're just a stupid kid. You're just born that way, right? So that's why you got an F. That's why you don't understand. And Ilyenkov is saying, actually, no, that's the problem with the teacher and the school system and everything else that's affected in here that makes you say that. It's not the kid's fault that the kid is not good at math necessarily, simply because they have certain things that they lack in their brain biochemically. That doesn't exist. That's not the way it works. Okay, let's go to page 12. This is an interesting paragraph here. So theoretically, to say that nature, is to blame for our inabilities, he says, theoretically, such a position is incompetent. Morally, it is vile, because it is extremely anti-democratic. Now, look at the words that he's using, anti-democratic. Why? Well, I think we could say, why is that anti-democratic? To say that, to blame genetics, you're just dumb because you're born that way. Or you're dumb because you're a particular race. Or you're dumb because you're a girl and you don't understand science because you lack that rational part of your mind, like some of these idiots used to say, and probably still do, when they try to explain why there are less women in engineering in the United States. In the Soviet Union, women were not underrepresented in mathematics, for example. In America, they were. So what's the explanation? That American women are dumber genetically? No, it's a function of the politics. So what makes such sort of appeals to genetics and nature anti-democratic? Well, we can say because it's an a priori judgment of human capacities, right? That's a function of political ideology. Nor, of course, he says, is it in accord with the Marxist-Leninist understanding of the problem of thinking, or with the communist attitude to man. What is the communist attitude to man? The communist attitude to man for Ilyenkov is the full development of a human being. That's the political goal of communist society. To the extent that you can accomplish that means that you don't live in a communist society. Social relations are not conditioned that way. You may live in a capitalist society or a socialist society or whatever you want to call it. The society that he lived in was not a communist society, right? That's why full development was not a universal thing present in all Soviet people. But the goal was that, in his mind at least.
There was a wonderful anecdote about Marx. He was asked, are there people more intelligent than other people? And he responded, we will not know the answer to that question until we have full equality.
Exactly. That's one of the great sentences of
Marx said, that really fits here very nicely.
And to argue against that, to me, never made sense. To argue against such a statement and say, no, actually, some people just can't do it, and we can't let them, pollute the minds of the smart people. Why would anybody argue that is, incomprehensible to me.
Well, we also live in a culture where, especially in the United States today, where being smart is a disadvantage in many ways.
That's suicidal. That's absolutely suicidal.
If you ask the radical questions, or if you're in a position where you're really, you're really put down, you're kind of ostracized in many, many societies. Maybe not at, Princeton, Harvard, or at the elite institutions.
Silicon Valley.
What's that?
Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley.
It's one of the interesting things now that I think about, if you read a lot of the Soviet dissidents in Ilyenkov's time, because he wasn't a dissident, he wasn't a liberal kind of, he was a dissident in the sense that he was a critical voice from the left, But a lot of the famous dissidents in the Soviet Union were liberals.
Yeah.
And the only thing they complained, or the main thing they complained about the Soviet Union, was the lack of individual rights.
Sakharov.
Solzhenitsyn and all those people.
Solzhenitsyn, of course. Yeah.
But they never raised the question about the full development of human beings.
Right.
They just didn't get it.
Right.
You know? Even though there were Soviets.
Right.
Even though, which shows that this was very much still a society in motion. You know, this political view, Ilyenkov's political view, was not the dominant one in every part of society.
Let me ask you a question. It's a little bit of a, I suppose, dialectical thing. I mean, the concept of full development of human beings, because if we're in an inherited culture, so to speak, is always, there's a certain ambiguity, like what that could possibly mean. Does that mean that potentially people can learn 7 languages, 3, 2? Like, how do we measure what would be the full development of a human being, if you follow what I'm saying?
One way would be to be exposed to the entire cultural inheritance of your society. So to be exposed to poetry, to literature, to history, to reading and writing, to certain cultural formations, certain archetypes, however you want to think about it, in whichever framework you want to think about it. In other words, not to have segregation in the socialization process that's designed, enshrined in laws, for example.
It goes to what Michael said a little bit. Like you first have to have, there has to be stages for
Yeah.
that question to even.
Or, for
make
example,
sense.
don't organize everything in society through the lens of the capitalist economic logic. So don't organize your school system from grade 1 through the language of business. Don't, maintain these different spheres, right, of human development that you exposed the next generation of subjectivity to, right? So in other words, design your cities in a way where the best apartments are not always going to be determined economically. Or everybody's going to get clean water, or the cost of heating will be the same for everyone. It could have many different manifestations.
I think the working premise is always about the totality of knowledge and how one would approach that, through the transdisciplinary approach from day one. Instead of segregation of knowledges, specializations, etc., this kind of approach early on would begin to develop a much more organic and full human being, and something more in terms of gratification and satisfaction
in other words,
life itself.
You can say
the model, of course, was Marx in terms of economic and philosophical manuscripts of 44, where he meditates on we can poetize fish and hunt and poetize in the evening, do philosophy, etc. So really, in a sense, this presupposes in a way the solving of the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom. That's the first step, I guess, for the Marxist thing, and which is what the Soviet Union really did try to do at some levels in the early going.
But then again, on the speculative level, and to perhaps inappropriately paraphrase Ilyenkov, full development of human being or human subject is perhaps to acquire the power of judgment, to acquire the ability of self-negation.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is rational self-criticism, is what Ilyenkov says.
Yes,
rational self-criticism.
Or in Hegelian, it would be the ability to engage in the dimension of negativity.
Well, as we know in the next when he approaches those very intense sections on describing contradictions, to be able to identify a contradiction that affects you in life, and to be able to overcome it or at least engage with it, that's the mark of a fully developed human being.
And if we actually try to apply this dimension, the rational, the power of rational self-criticism, to the notion of fully developed human being in its organicity, perhaps we can even say that the highest form of full development is its alienation. Can we even entertain that thought?
In the sense that again, this is kind of like that question. He's saying something like this. The communist attitude of man, full development, and by forcing us to ask that question, what is the full development of a human being? There's a good pedagogy here. He's basically pointing our attention to fundamental questions that we need to wrestle with, and then it's up to us to figure that out for ourselves. In other words, how do we understand full development of a human being? That's something important to think about.
It's a political question.
It's a political question, fundamental political question. The fundamental political question shouldn't be, how do I get to pay for my health insurance? That's pathetic. That's the dumbest thing you can possibly, that's a wasted human
The
life.
government should pay for my health care.
Yeah, because because I'm part of this society, right? I contribute to this society. Why is it up to me to find money to pay some other person who supposedly lives also in this polity, in this society, who for some reason, as a private atomistic individual, has control over my health? That's insane. Like if Ilyenkov was alive today, he'd be like, you're crazy. This is an insane society. It's violently barbaric.
It is insane.
It's violently barbaric.
That's the working premise. It is
That's why he
insane.
killed himself, because he knew where he was going.
Why wouldn't we just start there? It is insane.
You know, Ilyenkov
The
cut his
whole
own
thing
throat,
is
by the way.
not
That's how he died. Because
What?
he
cut his own throat.
at the end of his life, I mean, he suffered, he suffered from depression increasingly as he saw in the late 70s in Moscow State University, a lot of the famous professors were retiring or whatnot, and the next generation of intellectuals and students were liberals. So there's a famous case where he delivered a lecture in the Institute of Psychology, which was the most kind of like academically gifted, perhaps, and a lot of the famous Soviet psychologists taught there. And he delivered a lecture, and he was talking about things like full human development. And he said students were laughing at him, like, "What are you talking about, you crazy, stupid old Marxist?" And Ilyenkov kind of understood that they were losing the battle. The Marxists were losing the battle against the liberals, and he killed himself. He cut his throat. He cut his carotid artery with his combat knife. Yeah. I mean, there's a background story. There's an essay he wrote on the cosmology of, early 50s essay where he talks about kind of suicide. I mean, he talks about sort of humans, and it's sort of like a phantasmagorical essay. I'll share it. But this was a very intense person.
How old was he when he died?
Huh?
How old was he?
57 or 58?
He's very early, just at the height of his powers.
Yeah, that's
Just beginning to
It's a more.
Wow.
Some of his students wrote that had he witnessed the pathetic way through which the Soviets folded
would've
into
done it
liberals, he
much
would have
earlier.
killed himself again.
Again, right.
Or he would
Doubly.
have killed somebody
Yeah.
before. I mean, these were serious revolutionary.
I mean, it was part of the problem there. I mean, in
I
a
think
certain way.
it's a more
Yeah.
dignified death than the death of Deleuze, which in the end is very ambiguous. Did he really kill
Well,
himself?
he suffered from.
Well,
Well, he
Deleuze
was
was,
sick.
they couldn't.
He was no joke. I mean, he was a real soldier too. Deleuze was the real
Couldn't
deal.
breathe.
He jumped because he didn't wanted to feel it.
He couldn't breathe
was
anymore.
feeling
He
no
couldn't
more.
Did he just fall?
He didn't.
No.
Like Poulan's up. Didn't just fall.
That's not,
These were serious. I mean, these were. Yeah, he was not.
Poulan's had problems with the women always, but on the other hand,
I think what
he had-
Poulan says was
Yeah.
not as
Yeah.
just. I mean, it was
Yeah.
sort of maybe reasons of depression. With Deleuze, it was more like
Right.
he doesn't want to physically live
Yeah.
in a crippled way
Yeah,
that
yeah,
way, and he
yeah,
made that
yeah,
choice,
yeah.
and he killed himself.
Disabled, really. I mean, completely.
He did have a lung. His lung was removed
Yeah.
years before in a surgery to deal with pneumonia, or not pneumonia,
Didn't
tuberculosis.
Sartre say something like that? Only philosophical choice is suicide?
Yeah.
No, the
Kind of.
most pressing problem of the 20th century mysticism, the serious question of our era is the suicide.
Ilyenkov did it with a combat knife. I mean,
Right.
you know.
Anyway.
Well,
So-
Andre Gortz, I mean, they were members of the Hemlock Society.
Yeah.
His wife, died, and then he said.
By the way,
"Time for me to go."
this is a remarkable book. If you're interested,
Socrates.
Yeah.
if you're interested in reading
Yeah, he
that,
chose his death.
Exactly.
Nietzsche's reading of Socrates is very interesting in this context.
Yeah.
if you want to
Socrates
read,
desired his death in the twilight of the hour.
Yes.
The problem of Socrates. He wished his own death, right?
if you want to read a great book, a great love story.
The traitor.
No, when Gortz and his wife committed suicide, he wrote a book which was a love letter to his wife right before he killed himself.
Right,
It's about 60 or 70 pages.
right.
It's sort of his appreciation of her and their relationship and so on and so. I mean, and then they killed themselves because they had debilitating illnesses, or one of them had a terminal diagnosis, and the
She
other
did.
person,
She
and
did.
he was like, well, he's
No, he
going to check
couldn't live
out too.
without her.
What's
Yeah.
the title of that?
I forget, but if
Yeah.
you
Yeah, look up,
maybe it's called. I think it's called a love letter,
Yeah, it's
or
on-
subtitle is a love letter.
Gerard
It's one of the most
Gortz is
extraordinary.
his real name. Andre
That
Gorsuch's,
that documentary that you sent
Oh,
around,
wow.
which I think I'll post. Maybe I'll post it to the website.
The Ilyenkov
sometime.
documentary, yeah.
Is really great and shows those moments. Like someone tells a story in that film about how they were supposed to go to his house, and he was always like super welcoming, had people over every night.
Incredible.
He said no that one day.
Well,
and that was it.
the amazing survivor of all of this was Boris Eichenbaum. Because he was able to, Victor Shklovsky,
Shklovsky, yeah.
Shklovsky, who was able to survive, both the purges, the 50s and 60s, and just lived in his books in a certain way. Very interesting, witness to an error.
And of course,
Very good book.
there was a certain liberalism in Soviet society in the sense that permissiveness that is underappreciated
Right.
in the West, which was, I learned about this a couple of years ago in Sofia in Bulgaria when I was talking to my friends who were older in their 60s and they were alive in the 70s and 80s, and they were like, basically when, let's say Foucault publishes a book in Paris, 3 days later it's in Sofia or it's in Moscow.
Yeah.
In other words, everything was available.
Yeah.
Like, you could get it, nobody's gonna like arrest you and send you to Siberia because you have a Foucault's
Right,
latest
exactly.
book. I mean, these are,
Well, that's what led to the fall of the wall, but anyway.
right. But wait, but I had an idea of what you were saying.
Daughter, Jane, doing some
Yeah.
porn in Czechoslovakia,
If you haven't watched the,
All this creeping third wayism.
if you haven't watched the Ilyenkov documentary, we linked it on our website.
No, I don't think I did. I sent it out as an email,
Ah,
but I'll
okay.
definitely
So
post
we'll link
it.
it.
Yeah.
It's done by a young Russian filmmaker, and it's interesting. And there are clips of Ilyenkov lecturing. He spoke with this kind of very slow, melodic voice, but you can also hear Suvorov, his student, the psychologist who was deaf, mute, and he speaks. He narrates and there's a wonderful quote line that I shared last time from Mayakovsky on his funeral eulogy of the great poet who committed suicide in the 20s.
You see him?
Yes. And
There you go.
Mayakovsky said, to die is very easy, but to live is infinitely more difficult.
It's true.
He was paraphrasing Yesenin's own.
You said he managed to write some of the most depressing stuff.
Well, of course.
Oh.
Yeah.
One note on the documentary, though, is that if you have to turn on the English closed captions
Yes.
Otherwise,
It's in Russian.
in
yeah.
Russian.
But my friends in Sofia who attended some of the lectures of Ilyenkov, they said he was a spellbinding lecturer. Hundreds of people in the lecture hall, comes out, and the famous opening was he takes out a box of matches and he asks the students, what is this? And somebody says, well, it's a box of matches. He says, no, it's the idea of a match. And then it begins like the set from Socrates, from Plato, I mean, these people were masters, They lectured basically, kind of like your friends at the new school. They lectured. They basically lectured for hours. There's no group work, okay? So maybe just a few, because these are very intense sections here on this page 12. So top of page 12. In terms of natural endowment, we're all equal in the sense that 99% of people enter life in this world with a biologically normal brain capable in principle with a little less or a little more difficulty of mastering all of the abilities developed by their predecessors. In other words, here's the interesting point. Again, he's emphasizing this obsessively because he's fighting against positivists who argue the opposite, the biological determinists, right? He's saying, look, we are all equal in natural endowment because we're all born with the same DNA, or at least we share, statistically, we're identical in terms of our DNA endowment. So we have the apparatus to learn all of the abilities that we inherit from our own, from the world that we live in, right? And that's an important thing. And it all behooves us to dump onto nature the sins of society. It ill behooves us. We shouldn't do that. Don't blame nature for giving you bad genes if you live in a fucked up society that placed you in a condition of underdevelopment. That's where you should turn your blame, to the politics, not to your genetics. I wonder how many people still think that genetics predetermine their natural ability, or God. Probably more people think God. Predestination or whatever.
But the Soviets' understanding was, in a way, engaging in this predestination in the sense that history is on the Soviet side, And it's precisely because
It
of
was
that
mechanical.
everybody works even harder because they have this sense of destiny.
But I think that was an important, they had to do it that way. They had to mechanistically say that history is in their side, because otherwise they might as well give up, because look at the odds. You know? The major expansion of the Soviet public school system started right after the revolution, with Lenin, right at the beginning, and the first minister of education. Who was the first commissar of education? I should have known this. I knew this, but I forgot. So there was an explosion of formation of schools, universities, institutes. Within the first decade, from 1917 to 27, was the largest explosion expansion of an educational system, which means schools, public libraries, university research institutes, and so on and so forth, in human history since the French Revolution, which basically means a human history period. I traced a statistic once in terms of the number. I think they went from like 15 universities in 1915 or something to like 400 in 1937 or something like that. That's the product of this kind of thinking, about transitioning from a backward society, which fundamentally underdeveloped human beings, and to use this language of full development versus less than full development, to a society that develops people more fully rather than less. Well, you got to put in the effort. You got to create the schools, the frameworks. You have to train. You have to make reading a normal part of everyday life and not a special thing. That this notion of the izbushka, the little basement library in the village. There's a great writer, Soviet writer, who died in 1953, I think same time as Stalin died, Platonov. One of the greatest writers of the 20th century, novelist, essayist, playwright, very intense writer. Sometimes very depressing, very intense. Platonov has a short story based on his experiences. He was also a railroad engineer by trade. So right after the revolution, as a young man, he was not only writing, but he was going out there in these villages, like electrifying, like laying down electricity. And he said he attended this party at this village once in the middle of nowhere where they just got electricity. So how did they bring electricity to the village? They had several light bulbs, like public lighting, right? So they lighted the streets up in the village, the main street. So they did two things, the new Soviet government, right? They brought electricity to the village, and they created a library, which they staffed with books, like 40 or 50 books that anybody could get. So they had a school with a library, which was basically one room, and they brought electricity. Now, how did the electricity get created? There was a motorcycle with the wheels removed, and a guy whose job was to sit on the motorcycle and keep it running during the evening hours, right? So he just ran the motorcycle, and the engine kept running, and electricity was produced that powered the lights, and they had poetry reading. And the villagers were like, holy shit, this is cool, for two reasons. Once, they were like, electricity, artificial lighting, which is something very new. And second of all, somebody was reading the poetry, and some of them, they're also learning how to read and write. And they're like, okay, I get it. That's pretty amazing. Platonov wrote this down. He's like, there was a guy outside on a stationary motorbike gunning the engine to keep the lights running. That's how it started.
I'm thinking of Bataille's wasteful expenditure. This is like a sublime expression of wasteful expenditure.
That's true, right? That's a beautiful writer. That's a great writer, Bataille, right? We read Bataille in one of our
seminars. It is pure evil. Pure evil.
Who's that?
Pure Bataille.
He's pure evil. He wrote a book called Literature and Evil.
I haven't read that book. I was thinking of The Accursed Share, and reading the Accursed Share made me physically sick in a way.
Yeah.
He got kicked out of the Surrealist movement, because he was so virulent.
Well, we'll go back to it. I don't want to get sad, because we're only on page 12. It will take 4 months to finish this essay. So
we even got to theory.
I just want to emphasize some of these sections because I feel they're very important. It ill behooves us to dump onto nature the sins of society, which will... Okay, now here, check this out. Next sentence. It is necessary to open up each person's access to the conditions of human development. Again, that's a question. How do you do that? Well, that's up to you to figure out. That's up to us to figure out if we're interested in this matter. How do we open the conditions for the development of the ability to think independently? Which means the same thing as giving people access to their own human development. This is Kant, of course. This is in the tradition of what Kant said in the essay on what is enlightenment. A mature human being is a human being who can think for themselves and does not always rely on other people when it comes to how to live their life.
Well,
you can rely on others for some
presupposes
times, but
understanding.
not all the time.
Yeah.
What?
It presupposes understanding.
And it presupposes
It's just you
understanding.
don't think for yourself, it presupposes.
It presupposes understanding.
Yeah.
So how do you open up the gates, so to speak, which by the way also what democracy is for Ilyenkov. That's what a democratic society is. A democratic society is a society where each person's access to the conditions of human development, i.e. the ability to think independently, which means to understand as well, is available and activated. Okay? It's not a function of how much money you have. It's not a function of who your father is or what race you are and all this nonsense that is created in a political ideology that argues the opposite, that people are fundamentally unequal and some are better than others genetically. Right? So, to think independently is one of the chief components of human culture. Not to be, anyways. And the school is obliged to do this. This is interesting because if we read Althusser, ideological state apparatuses of which the school is one example, is not necessarily a bad thing politically. Depends what kind of an ideological state apparatus is and what its end goals are. Intelligence is not a natural gift. He keeps repeating this, because this is a polemical battle. It is society's gift to a person. What is John F. Kennedy's thing? Don't ask, what was that? Don't ask
what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Ilyenkov's saying, no, it's okay to ask what your country can do for you.
Absolutely.
JFK got it partially right. He missed the other half. It is incidentally a gift that he will later repay 100-fold if you got it from society. From the point of view of a developed society, the most profitable of capital investments. Like all this liberal stuff today, you go invest in yourself to be like, lifelong learning and all this stuff. It sounds like they're saying this, but of course they mean it in a much narrower sense,
Right.
as simply selling your ability, your labor power. Sell that part of you to whoever wants to buy. But they're using the language that Ilyenkov might also use. An intelligently organized, that is communist society, that's an intelligent organization, can be constituted only by intelligent people. Can't build a communist society out of a barbaric liberal society or barbaric, fundamentalist religious society or whatever. You can't do it if you do not work on human intelligence. I don't want to use that word human intelligence because it immediately has these connotations of all this other stuff, but we know how he's using it. And never for a minute must we forget that it is precisely the people of the communist future who are sitting behind school desks today. So the stakes are pretty high. If you want to live in a society that's not capitalist dominated, you have to figure out how to reorganize the schooling process. Because that's where most people get socialized in the modern world. Young kids and children and young adults spend more time in school than they spend anywhere else. Grades K through 12. So you got to pay attention to what happens in school, like right here. So I wrote a note here. Capitalist society only seeks the intelligence of the few or a type of particular intellectual connection. Let's just keep reading. The mind, the ability to think independently. So now, this essay is kind of like, you get what Aristotle is, deceptively simple sounding. But so far we've talked about what is communism politically, as a political project. We've talked about the distinction between mind and brain. We formulated a few important questions for our time, such as that question. Now the next question is, what is the mind? And what does it mean to think? What is called thinking? The mind, the ability to think independently, takes form and develops only in the course of individual assimilation of the intellectual culture of the epoch. And here you have Ilyenkov beginning the logical movements, right? Individually, you can only develop it fully if you individually assimilate and learn how to think, inherit, incorporate, make sense, understand your culture that you inherit, rebel against it, use it, whatever. But here you have the beginnings of this movement, particular, universal, and singular. So now you have the logical categories that he's going to transition to from Hegel. Aristotle then reworked from Hegel, right? The category of the universal, the particular, and the singular, and all the different iterations. That's why he's emphasizing. He's saying that the ability to think independently takes form and develops only in the course of individual assimilation of the intellectual culture of the epoch. So group work, where you are only responsible for part of the lesson on the American, abolitionist movement, like these kids are studying, if you only experience this history partially because you were group member 3 in this group and you got the question about John Brown, but you didn't really wrestle with Tubman, you're not really getting it. Because you individually have to ultimately assimilate the intellectual culture, all of it. Whether that involves your history, mathematics, knowledge of literature, work skills, whatever, appreciation of music. You have to assimilate all of it. Yes?
Doesn't that then, the critique then, doesn't that become like a kind of a fantasy of an accelerated, very similar to the capitalist imagination of like this maximum possibilities of all things, when in fact, for example, to be a very good woodworker, in reality, you cannot also absorb all of the history of abolition?
He says you can. He's saying you can not only be a good woodworker, but you can also absorb and understand American history. You can also understand to appreciate jazz music.
And how
doesn't have to be 5 languages. No, it doesn't have to be 5 languages. On the initial level, it has to be. You have to be able to inherit fully the stuff that came before you in this society. Now, whether that's you inherit from your grandmother interest in woodworking because you're exposed to it when you're 5 years old because that's what she did for work and you started learning that early on. That's part of you. That's part of the process. But you also should be exposed to all the other things that happened before you that are important in your society, that affected your society, whether it's your family, your friends, your neighborhood, your city, the broader cultural, however you want to define them. You have to be exposed and understand all of that in totality. Why not?
No negation. I just wonder whether it's again an idealistic fantasy of the
in this society it is.
In our society,
of course. And also dialectically, if you think about this, what's really missing in all of this is any kind of connecting corridor. This is what the dialectic can do. It can actually connect things. You have this perspective, like almost didactic memory going on here, which you'll go through at the next level. This kind of repetition of a figure. This is what this kind of pedagogy does, right? The repetition. Now I know about Harriet Beecher, or Harriet Tubman, or I know about Frederick Douglass, and that's it, right? It becomes almost, it's only facticity. It's only factional in a certain way. So what's left out here is not the ability to quantitatively speak 6 or 7 languages.
Yeah.
What's left out is this ability to connect, to make a connecting corridor, to put in the material language, between ideas, figures, etc. When you look at this around this room, it's pictures, pictures, pictures. It's figure, figure, figures. It's no topics. It's no ideas, right, in a sense. Only, very little topics, right, in a sense.
But the important thing is...
And they're not making connections between this. It's just one big,
And of course, we learn together, we play together with our peers, we work together, we hang out with our friends together, but another important part of this sort of learning the ability to fully develop or to think or to develop the mind is to function, is to also individually assimilate all this stuff.
Right, and that's, I think, crucial. I think you really hit it here, at least to me, that, what capitalism does, it always claims this great individualism, but it's not individualistic at all. It's complete conformity. The individual is never developed.
Because the individual doesn't know enough, hasn't assimilated enough. Especially now with the digital social objects, you can just consult Google. You have to know even less than ever before.
Right.
You know how psychoanalysis, adaptive psychoanalysis, ego psychology, everything that became Americanized, the Americanization of psychoanalysis was basically a conformist ideology to get you prepared to go to work. It has nothing to do with the subversion of what Freud and you know, of course, the people afterwards, such as Fenichel, a lot of people that are forgotten because everybody jumps from Freud to Lacan. There are a lot of in-between. Right, yes, exactly. So the subversive import is always, you know, is undone in terms of a conformist logic. Oh, it's your neurosis. We all have neurosis. You know how this goes. Right. Go to work, adapt to the boss. You know, learn how to cope.
I'm stressed.
You know the thing. Yeah, I'm stressed. Everybody's fucking stressed.
Also, if I'm a great scientist, unless my knowledge is not abstract, unless it's connected to the rest of the knowledge, then it's useless.
That's a great point, Josh, because you reminded me. Ilyenkov says in this essay, if you remember, the underdeveloped human being thinks abstractly. Right. The fully formed person who knows how to think thinks concretely.
Absolutely.
Which is an inversion of the popular notion that the great thinker, or you know, the Einstein thought abstractly, man, because he thought about gravity on the level of solar systems. That's concrete thinking.
Right. Of course.
I have a question about the case of Google.
Google?
Yes. Google? So according to Ilyenkov, later in this essay, he pointed out the importance of the creative power of forgetting. Perhaps
the creative power of
forgetting.
Yes.
So is it possible to say that Google actually has its lends us our advantage, so I don't have to memorize all this stupid
but
data?
Google doesn't forget anything. Now it would be different if like its database of answers got auto-erased every 3 weeks.
With Google is you're didactically being instructed in a compelled way. You're not making connections with Google. You're just searching for information. There's a difference between informational gathering and thinking here.
Right.
You know, these distinctions.
By the way, I want to make a distinction here between these words. Information.
I do search information so that I can actually back it up. You know,
Sure.
There are interesting words here that I think we need to develop if we're interested in this. The word information, if you hyphenate it, it's clarified, right? That its meaning could be something that is in the process of formation. So it becomes like a Nietzsche writes a lot about this, right? The process of becoming, or Heidegger, Marx, you know, the flux, the notion of. So what do you mean by information? Like, do you have access to information? Somebody might say today, right? And the question should be like, what do you mean by information? What they often mean when like a computer scientist, like a Googler, you know, these like savants, when they say we got the best information, what they really mean is we got the best data. Data, if we go to the Latin roots, is grounded in datum, and datum is something that is well formed and no longer subject to change. So data is dead.
Static.
Data is basically congealed things that happen. Human labor, ideas, it's static. Something that is data is no longer of interest to the active mind. Because the moment I put something in the form of data, I've already used it. I already made sense of it, and I just stored it for later reference. Okay?
I mean, it's also politically...
It's not the same as information, but it's used that way.
It's socially and politically produced, too. This is not an objective fact. This is substantiated politically, ultimately.
Right.
So everything you Google ultimately has politics behind it.
Starting from what's displayed on the first page rather than the 9th page. That's not an accident. Right?
Of course.
Every time you Google, you add a little bit to the bottom line, right?
To their bottom line, which is kind of an amazing hustle. Every time you search the internet, they make money.
Right, and the marginal
Just
cost of
cheap
that
rap.
search is zero.
Right, and it costs them zero.
Yeah, never before has there been a machine quite like this one.
And it's an intelligence collection mechanism too, built in. So there's multiple levels
There's a big debate in sociology, advanced etc. right now about whether or not the bubbles that are created, that we think that we're in a world where on Facebook, we're actually, the algorithms work to keep us in a very limited bubble point, so we don't really see other things. We think we do, we don't. Whether or not that's functioning to create this public, whether it's working as public democracy or is really completely not.
I mean,
it's very hard to really determine it.
I feel like the only time artificial intelligence becomes useful socially is when there's a corresponding dumbification of the humans who are interacting in a certain way in which AI is plugged into. That's the only way AI can become useful in terms of playing a social role. Now, for other reasons, they could be very powerful. Like if I'm doing a scientific experiment and I'm crunching through data from my space telescope, it's very profoundly useful. But as a way of determining, like, what people think about Trump versus, Pelosi or whatever, well, the only reason you're going to get something useful from that analysis is if people's understanding of politics is so primitive that they actually reduce it to like a yes or no, or I like her because she's a woman, or I like him because, he's who he is and whatnot. If you reduce politics to that, then AI can tell you a lot.
And he says something like this in the later part of this essay about mathematicians, the genius child mathematicians. It's very easy to be a child genius.
Right.
In math, but not in politics.
Not in politics, because it's a simpler thing.
Right.
Because you don't deal directly with other people, and that's where the complexities emerge. It's easier to deal with numbers. There's a clarity to it, And Einstein said that. He said, "Don't use the method with which I do theoretical physics in politics." He says it's not going to work. Einstein said this. He knew this very well. But when you socialize cybernetics, that's what they're doing. They're applying methods that make sense in programming computers, because that's the only way you can program a computer. It's a particular machine that can only function in a well-ordered framework of particular mathematical truths, and that's incredible that somebody figured that out. But once you apply that body of knowledge in a different field to which it's ill-suited, and you force people to function that way, well, that's when you have the problems. That's sort of like the misuse of the cybernetics. You got to use it for the proper thing. Shoot missiles down, radar, all kinds of things. But don't use it to structure social relations. You can, but you're not going to have a democracy then. You're going to have a different kind of society.
Well, the structure has been towards the increasing militarization of everyday life.
You're going to have an armed camp. You're going to have a concentration camp.
Younger Heidegger and Schmidt would be, very, very impressed with this kind of work machine, so to speak.
Yeah.
Achtung, again.
And they would be against it.
Of course they're going to be.
They would be violently against it.
Of course. This was what along the line was really about the conversation between, Heidegger and Juncker. Where we take a step into technology, where it's just really happened.
This is where Heidegger and those Marxists were thought about this way, like Ilyenkov. They intersect. They're on the same side here. All right. So intelligence is not so that second paragraph, the mind, the ability to think independently, takes the form only in the course of individual assimilation. I think that's an important point. The individual assimilation that has to happen too. Properly speaking, so what is the mind now? How thinking develops. What is the mind? That's a big question. The mind is none other than this intellectual culture, transformed into a personal possession and legacy, into the principle of a person's activity. So here you have, this is what Hegel studied, what he studied in logic. Because how does the mind develop? The mind develops through these kinds of transformation into the singular, whether it's some kind of a universal object or facet of social life that becomes personalized, if you will, and assimilated into your own thinking, right? Or maybe some particular aspect of your culture now has become internalized and starts to affect your life. If you use that language of the movement from the universal to the particular to the singular, it becomes much more easy to describe how the mind functions. Because otherwise you just talk about the mind through biochemistry. Just a bunch of neurons. This part of your brain fires up when you shoot it in an MRI or whatever. That's useful if you're studying whether the mind is sick on the level of biochemistry. But that's not going to tell you anything about the cultural development of the person. So how do you study what the mind is? Not the brain, but the mind. Well, you have to understand, first of all, that the mind is the intellectual culture of the society that you live in, or the part of society that you're exposed to, transformed into a personal possession of legacy. So the mind is the process of transformation of what exists in your society into your own processed, what I mean?
Social reproduction.
Yeah. So the mind is not something that you do simply sitting at home and reading books and figuring things out. That's not really what the mind is. The mind is the process.
Yeah.
Your mind is not a thing. Your mind is, in other words, the mind develops dyadically as it is subject to various social processes. It's schooling, activity-related things, like you're building a boat with your hands and you're struggling with that process. You just hung out with your friends and you talked about X, Y, Z. These kinds of dynamic processes are literally what your mind is. So the mind is not the brain. It's not something inside your head. That's just the apparatus that makes you able to have those social interactions out of which you learn about the world, you do things, you comprehend things, you react things, you feel things. And that's what develops your sense of awareness of what is and what isn't. And you can say that you have a mind. So the mind is a relation. It's not a thing. It's kind of like Marx's description of capital, in a certain sense.
Okay.
So the mind is intellectual, the intellectual culture that you were exposed to, that's transformed into a personal possession and legacy, which essentially into principles that guide your activity. Mind is made up of nothing else but this. To use the high-flown language of philosophy, it is the individualized spiritual wealth of society. But you got to have access to that society.
That's very Hegelian.
It's a Hegelian
Yeah,
approach.
Put it mildly.
It relates to the objective spirit.
Put it mildly.
Individualized,
Yeah.
can you say it again?
At page 12,
Page 12.
it's the
exactly.
individualized spiritual wealth of society. But of course, you have to gain access to that to that spiritual wealth of society. So that's the first fight. In the American context, this is the fight they had in the 60s and 50s over access to basic education. Right? If you don't have access to basic education on an equal basis to everybody else, to other Americans, then there's no way you're going to have access to the spiritual wealth of society.
The real question for us going forward is not so much its access, but it's really about curriculum. What are the schools teaching?
Yeah.
Going back to this whole thing about Google and being able to Google and helping, the evaluation of sources is really the major power of judgment that we need today. How do you evaluate the source of where that, quote, information is coming from? What is what is behind the stasis of the data, etc.? How is this formed, etc.? These kind of questions are absolutely necessary. So it's not only that you build a beautiful school in Bed-Stuy or Do or Die, or out in East New York. It's really about what the syllabus, the curriculum's about. This is really the challenge. And as you know, being a professor like I know, in a sense, this has always become, the most tedious part of being in a faculty, that they don't know where to go with the curriculum.
Well, to go back to the connections, what I discover in my classes is that in general, there's a complete disconnect. There's no connections that most of the students make already having come into college.
Right.
There's no connections that are made between different parts of our common inherited cultures. Like, there's no connection necessarily made between Tubman and other things that were happening in the context of her life, or how this person that we inherited her sort of presence in American history, how does that, so there's no connections. It's almost like if you have like a network, it's almost like if you have like a network of meanings, if you will. This is a very positive thing, but if you have like a network of things, it's the connections that are severed.
Right.
There might be nodes. Oh yeah, Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad. I got it. 19th century. Okay. Oh, Civil Rights Movement, 1950. Yes, I know some important things about it, but it's the contextualization. It's the making sense part, which is the connections, is not developed, and that's why that's the fundamental thing that Ilyenkov is saying needs to be developed in order to understand it.
Yeah, I'm surprised there's no Thoreau here. In any case.
There's a whiteboard.
because he's
Or John Brown.
Yeah.
Oh.
I know,
It's
but
just-
Thoreau then connects to this
Yeah,
particular
Of course,
religious
and
movement,
Emerson, the transcendentalist tradition.
Exactly.
Melville,
So-
who wrote,
exactly.
I mean, brilliant
So it's
pieces.
great
I mean, you
and-
read Benito Cereno, it's one of the greatest, tracks against colonialism. I mean,
Absolutely. I mean,
the whole thing.
this is
I have
exactly
34 students, one philosophy class. Not one person has heard the name Herman Melville. Can you imagine? And they come from public schools, of the high
So-
rank. Brooklyn Tech, Midwood, Fort Hamilton, Edward Morrow, right? They're coming from these schools. Not one person in the class knew. I'm reading Billy Budd in the class as philosophical work on.
in
justice
Ilyenkov's
and
language,
everything.
this would be a shortcoming where the shared historical cultural inheritance of our society has not been transmitted to those
Yes,
students.
well, it's
Right.
Stiegler taking care of generations. What is the transmission? Lacan, where's the transmission to the
That's
next
right.
generation?
And look at the next
Where's the
paragraph.
transfer?
Did you have a
I
question?
had a
Deep
thought,
point.
which is maybe I'm just being negative, but I'm wondering in the sense of, I can never say his name right, is he not, in a sense, a theorist for the second movement, so to say, in a communist society? Like, his theory, his thinking here, it seems like it's difficult to apply it, so to say, within the dialectical situation of advanced capitalism as such as we are, because of the various
You
problems.
can't do it in a capitalist
No,
society.
it's
It's
right.
completely out of the question. Because
Right.
the starting premises and the
Right.
political goal is
Right.
completely different.
Right,
The goal of a capitalist society is not to think in terms of full development of human beings.
right.
Or liberation.
That's completely not part of the
the
question.
imagery of it, but yeah.
The goal is to
But
reproduce the
never-
system as is.
I've
This
never
is what
seen.
the ideological state apparatuses do in that society.
Look, I've never seen. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm sure, but I've never seen a statement that says the goal. In the American mythology in the American mythology of the American dream, the fundamental goal is the full development of human beings. That statement doesn't happen. You don't see that statement. You might see different statements, like the American dream means what? The freedom to do whatever you're predisposed to doing, to live better than your parents did, right? Or to
Own a house.
own a house. There's different dreams.
It's usually approached like maximum freedom or.
Maximum freedom of basically doing whatever
Right.
you deem
But
that
the
need to
freedom
be.
of kind of real-
Freedom
Well,
to
it's
travel,
kind of-
freedom to shop.
Right, this is kind of
Yeah.
Kantian, I think, this weird.
By the way, communists can say, sure, we can incorporate that part of the liberal dream. We can say, yeah, of course, we believe
Do whatever you
in
want,
doing
you don't
as,
hurt anyone else.
yeah, whatever your
And the
heart
dream is
wishes,
attacked
as
by
long
the
as you don't
beach.
harm others.
Desolation angels, for example.
Yeah.
The Beat Generation are great at this. Desolation angels on the road. Think about it. What they're really doing there in terms of their critique, why they're so powerful. And then you look at Dylan when he writes Desolation Row, right? Einstein ends up on playing violin. He was famous long ago, right? I mean, think about these things in the context of what happens in kind of this destruction, right, of this value system of the reproduction of the system as is, and why these movements, right, in a way, you talked about Balibar, for example, what they wanted to do in the Reading Capital group, they wanted to do transcontinental Route 66 travel in the United States. For them, that was the free movement of the United States,
But
being on the road.
speaking
because
of
they
the-
related to Neil Cassidy and the Kerouac moment, for Getty coming out of the mind, this whole movement, right? From
But
Route
speaking
66.
of the internalizing the historical cultural sort of inheritance, think about it. How can you? Let's say our goal is to change society in some way, right? So let's say our goal is we're in 1960, just to use an example, and our goal is to overcome segregation, because for all the obvious reasons, that's a particularly violent and vicious and unjustifiable way of running society. How are you going to affect political change if you have not fully internalized the cultural historical inheritance of your society that has created segregation?
Yes, exactly.
And if you want a good example of people who understood this very fundamentally, look at the Black Panthers. I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch any of the talks of Daruba bin Wahad. He's like a prominent New York City Black Panther, intellectual, revolutionary, thinker, Marxist. And Daruba bin Wahad can talk to you about American history and American politics in overwhelming detail. He knows the history, he knows the dates, he knows, court decisions from 1834. He's a Black Panther. So as the first prerequisite, if you're going to do politics, the Black Panthers understood you have to know your history and your cultural sort of
Yeah.
You know,
movements
the great-
completely. You have to
the
know
great
it
story of
exhaustively.
Huey Newton, why Huey Newton became Huey Newton, because he knew when the police were, tracking them down, he knew that they could only be 90, I don't know the exact amount.
Yeah, you have to
cannot
study.
come any closer to us because it's in the code that you cannot be any closer than 90 feet to us here.
I mean,
He
you
knew
can-
the law.
you
He
can
knew the
watch
law. Yeah.
Duro bin Wahad, he speaks for 2 hours at the, I think, University of Virginia
Yeah.
or University of Iowa Law School. Lecture, 2 hours on American politics with no notes because the intellectual, the
They live
history,
it.
cultural
They live it.
knowledge has been
Of
internalized.
course.
Because that person knows how to think. It's exactly what Ilyenkov says everybody can learn how to do. So next paragraph, so 3 paragraphs in the bottom of page 12. And this, to put it simply, means that mind, what is mind? In parentheses, he clarifies a little bit. By mind, he means intelligence, talent, ability, etc. Is the natural state of mind. I'm emphasizing this because this is an important thing he's saying here, which might sound crazy. He says, the mind is the natural state of man, of human beings, the norm and not the exception. The mind is the normal result of the development of a biologically normal brain under normal human conditions. So in other words, if you are and if we are underdeveloped people who don't know how to think, that means we live in a fucked up society that essentially destroyed us or damaged us. So an underdeveloped human being who doesn't know how to understand and think the world that they live in is a victim of politics. Or if you don't want to use the language of victimhood, which I don't, is somebody who is oppressed. So Ilyenkov is giving us sort of a working definition of what political oppression is.
Kind of like euthanize.
Well, oppressed and depressed. I mean,
Yeah.
pushed down. There's no
Pushed down.
ability to
So
really
you
be
can't-
pressing on.
Yeah.
Right.
This is really interesting when Marx uses words such as oppressed. There's a meaning there. It's not only just we use it, so
Yeah.
it's a feeling, it's a pressure.
Is,
Yeah.
is it even possible to
Yeah.
engage a certain dialectical maneuver here that the suffering or the oppression induced by the existent socio-economic system as capitalism is also the forum through which emancipation takes place?
You mean the oppressing for certain types of thinking or accumulated ways of thinking?
The
Like,
general state of the poverty of intellect we were discussing.
So you're saying the necessity of alienation ultimately.
Or to paraphrase, I think it was Wagner's Parsifal, where the wound that is to be healed is through the spear that, I don't remember the exact phrase, but the point is that I think the point is that the form of oppression, which is capitalism, is also the form of emancipation in a way. So what I'm trying to
Well, I mean,
entertain here.
Marx is, does this in the manifesto that the grave diggers, that they're digging their own grave, and you would take the weapons that they have created
yes,
and then wield
and-
them against them if that's where you're coming from.
I see.
Yes,
But to see in capitalism a potential for liberation without the overturning or without a complete
and as
overall
Lenin said
system.
after,
Yeah, I
as
mean,
Lenin
it's
said
not-
after 17, Lenin is often, especially in the West, Lenin is not read very much after 1917 because Lenin already has power and everything Lenin went bad after that, right? All this stupidity. But Lenin, in power, especially said many important things related to this, which is if we try to develop a society that's more, sort of does not suffer from the violence and the handicap of capitalist society, in the beginning and always we have to use the heights of capitalist culture as well,
Right.
or ways of thinking. In other words, yes, we should read and internalize everything that is the product of capitalist society that we inherit, because we inherited, it's already conditioning our actions, right?
yes.
The only
So-
revolution that's lasted is the bourgeois revolution. I mean, if you want to think of
In
it
that
that
sense.
way, in that sense. I mean, yeah.
Yes, in the sense of destroying the culture, heritage, and in the environment, and to apply the notion of revolution to today's condition, I think, in a way, precisely because capital is irreversibly globalized, that it paves the condition for this concrete, quote-unquote, universal emancipation, that it is impossible to think of a certain emancipatory project within a confined polity, a country, a nation state, because capital is global and because oppression in a nation is global, that in order to even think of a certain project, I think the concrete path is to think the notion of communism as a problem.
But Ilyenkov is saying something much simpler.
Not especially a problem, because the project has not even been, put into motion.
Right.
Look,
in a sense.
think about it this way. We're so far away. Look, we're so far away from where Ilyenkov was in the 1960s. Think about it. He's saying things like, intelligence is not a natural gift. It's society's gift to a person. Now, if you say that today, like if you're a public figure running for office, I think you're crazy. In the context of this country, for example, right? Or in many other countries. In other words, we're so far away from even where this essay was at this point. But I just want to read, After you, I'll read.
Only even an inclination of that thought. Like some of the Sanders stuff, it's not really socialist, but it just borders a little bit on something like that.
It's light years away from this. This is like...
and even that gets...
Exactly.
But what I'm saying is...
Look what's going on in the dominant media against that.
But from my point of view...
I'm starting to keep a file on this.
From my point of view... From my point of view, I think a good place to start, if we want to think about it, is to start with these ideas, like these sort of stems, like where he's saying, intelligence is not a natural gift, it is society's gift. So what are the implications of that? What is the implication of defining the mind in this way, or the crippling of the mind? And look at the last two paragraphs on page 12, then we'll have to finish. But last two paragraphs, he says, page 12, conversely, the so-called stupid person, the person with an deficiency of powers of judgment, is above all a maimed person, a person with a crippled brain.
Exactly.
And this crippling of the organ of thinking is always the consequence of abnormal and unnatural, from the point of view of the true criteria of human culture, conditions. The result of crudely coercive pedagogical influences on this tender organ, especially in an early age. Okay? The organ of thinking is much more easily crippled than any other organ of the human body. This is another interesting, seemingly simple sentence. In other words, we obsess over how we get hurt today in society. We can get hurt by being sexually abused, by being emotionally abused. But what about the crippling of the mind? Which is much more devastating. I'm not saying that the other forms of abuse are not horrible. Of course they are. But if you want to really, along with the physical abuse and the sexual abuse, there's a corresponding and simultaneous crippling of the mind that happens. I mean, this is the most radical feminist critique would say this. That sexual abuse is actually at the same time a whole debasement of the human being as such. It's not just the sexual abuse and the emotional pain of that. But it's much deeper than that. That's why it's so serious when sexual abuse happens, or sexual violence. It's not just the sexual violence. Mm-hmm. It's the violence of your being on the level of the mind, because that's the fundamental level of what makes us who we are, right? So it is very difficult, after a certain age, quite impossible to fix. To cripple, it is simple, by means of a system of unnatural exercises. Here's a recipe for oppression. You want to oppress somebody or a group of people? Cripple their mind. Most easily through the education system.
Well,
that's the recipe, guaranteed to work.
Marco said 1978, America is the educational system, the systematic moralization of the...
And how do you do it? Look at the last sentence, Marcuse. And one of the most reliable methods, of course, he's talking about Soviet kind of pedagogy too that went this way, because there were strands of that as well. And one of the most reliable methods of such crippling of the brain and the intellect is the formal memorization of knowledge. So again, here we have the difference between knowledge and thinking.
Well, why doctors are mechanics.
I mean,
It's all memory
is
work.
he talking about the Soviet model
Yeah.
of just rote memory?
That wasn't the Soviet model in general. The Soviet model had different elements. You could, depending on the school, depending on the decade, depending on the particular.
Okay.
The school that I went to, for example, for the first 8 grades of
I
my life.
remember I went through my primary and secondary education in China, and it's exactly what Ilyenkov is describing.
My example was the
Totally.
opposite. Mine was
Totally
both.
cramming. Everything just crammed into my head.
Yeah, so you have both. My experience was you had to cram on the level of the individual. The way we were tested in the music school was the teacher would come and say, "Oh, Arto, please
We
get
got
up.
the police at the door.
Okay,
Yeah,
tell us about Harriet Tubman and the U.S. Civil War." And I had to talk in front of the class in the 5th grade for 10 minutes, explaining sort of, and I couldn't just do it by memorizing. I had to understand it because otherwise,
She killed 14 people.
I think so.
Yeah.
Who's this?
Harriet Tubman.
The underground.
Is that part of your
Oh,
lecture?
yeah, no, she was Jose Dolores in America.
And Sojourner Truth just wrote,